has to write the if else statement as a function, you like have a test and you have to solve it.
Yep.
So yes, it's already been if else statement as a function. So this one passes, but when I try to do the last else, it doesn't pass anymore.
Okay. So
the last else is
so here in these tests you can actually, so let's do a couple of things. Go back to where you're writing code. Let's comment out this whole second. Do a /* instead of //. Got asterisks. And then if you go to here, you can put an asterisk and then a slash. Okay. So now if you run the test, what's that look like? So you get the first 3 to go. And this is expected. I will gladly take your $30 to equal no can do. So my guess is somewhere in your code it says I will. Yeah, so it expects that.
But when I added the, like I did an if, else if, and then I added the last else to say some value over 2,500 result, I would gladly take your $30 because it didn't pass.
Okay, so let's try to do it again.
Okay.
Do the else before that. Before opening and closing the brackets, you can take else. Nope, you just put the curly braces. So it's not a function.
Okay, but we don't need to put some value greater than 2,500?
No, so else is like any other thing. So if it doesn't hit this and it doesn't hit this, then do this, no matter what it is. So if it's not less than 400 and it's not greater than 2,000, then do whatever you put inside of else. If you wanted to say an explicit thing, you have to do an else if.
Oh, so another, but so you can end it in another else if?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So it's there's going to be values where it doesn't get to the third one, right? So right here it says if some value is less than 400, then do this. So if I pass in 300, we're going to go to this first one, right? If I pass in 500, it'll say is 500 less than 400? No. Is 500 greater than 2,000? No. Is 500 greater than 2,500? No. And so what my result's going to end up being is blank. That's okay. If I say pass in 2,600, it's going to say, is my value less than 400? No. Is my value greater than 2,000? Yes. 2,600 is greater than 2,000. So I'm going to do this one. I'll never get to this one.
Okay.
So if you wanted to get to that one, you have to say and less than 2,500.
So literally and?
So it's space 2 ampersands, which are space some value less than 25. Yeah, I mean, we have to look back at the testing probably, but. Yep.
Oh, okay. Let me see. Okay, I didn't know why this one was working.
So then this one's not working in part because.
I kept rewriting it because it wasn't working. But
yeah. So what is NYC right there?
it's supposed to be the variable.
What? This variable?
Yes.
Okay. So return NYC. So it's saying evaluate NYC, and if NYC is true, then do okay, sounds good. Otherwise, no go.
Yeah.
So that should be fine. If that's what the thing is.
I swear it's not.
Well, it's probably breaking because some of the mistakes you had earlier on. I mean, that is the thing. The way these tests run, like if you mess up other parts of your file, you could end up failing other tests
Okay. Okay.
because you're not writing the code completely in isolation.
Okay. Well, so then you can't do the test out of order.
You shouldn't do the test out of order.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'll just try the rest of it then.
Yeah, but you're moving. You're good.
I went to a meetup yesterday.
Oh yeah.
Mhm.
What was the meetup?
It was about how to approach your job
Okay.
process, and they gave a lot of tips of like sites to use. I wrote them all down, even though she gave us the link to the presentation. I just wrote them
Yeah.
down. So let's see. Okay, so she gave a lot of sites for practicing and doing code challenges. Then she gave some sites for interview prep, like Interview Cake, Cramp, and some book, Cracking the Code of Interview.
Yep.
Then when you're applying, she gave Product Hunt, so you can look up employee handbooks.
Okay.
And Hunter for like organizing your job search.
Okay.
You know that site?
Nope.
It's like some site where you can actually save the job descriptions for jobs that you're interested in, even if you're not ready to apply, so that when you're organizing all of the places you want to apply to, it'll tell you like they use these programs that are in the job description, and you can track like the coding challenge and the interview process and everything to just keep it organized.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, she was telling us we might want to try the 100 Days of Code challenge. You know that one?
Nope.
It's on Twitter. I see people tweeting about it a lot. Basically, like you code for an hour each day and you like log your process, whatever you did that day, and share it. And then people like work together on projects, things like that, to build your portfolio.
How was it?
I'll probably be like 4 days in.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And then she was telling us about the October Fest things coming up. So
Yeah, because things like Interview Cake are generally like advanced algorithmic coding exercises, which are, I mean, like if you're applying for a job at a Google or a place like that, then they might ask you those questions. Even those guys are like walking away from that type of thing, though. It's just, a lot of times they're very complex algorithms, sorting algorithms. They're mathematical, conceptual problems that you wouldn't generally solve nowadays in coding. They were things that you had to solve in the 1980s because computers couldn't do them well.
Yeah.
But now they've been solved, so they're kind of silly. But there are a lot of things on Interview Cake, so you just want to try and find the ones that are more within your realm of like what you're learning right now, and then take that knowledge with you
She
to the
was
job.
telling us like the red flags and job postings. Like she showed us one that was like looking for a front end developer, but it said Python.
Uh-huh.
So like things like that, like you might want to learn for this because they don't know what they're looking for.
Yeah.
That's not a front end program.
Yeah.
And she was telling
Yeah,
us.
that's less likely though. Like, so my guess would be if I saw somebody put, we're looking for a front end developer and we want you to know some Python, what they're really saying is our back end is Python and it would be nice if you understood kind of how it works.
It's interesting because they, in the job description, they put like they were looking for someone who was advanced in JavaScript, but they didn't really outline like
What that means.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or, like why they wanted you to know Python, and she was telling us that like if you see job descriptions that say they're for front end or like junior developers, and they say like they need 2 years, then to not be intimidated if you don't have those years, because usually if they're looking for a senior person, it will say something about like mentoring or some other stuff she said, and that you should look for in the job description. They'll tell you if you are totally uncaught.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, the 2-year thing, 8 years, it is funny because people do that, and I think it does have some impact. It helps you to understand a little bit about how well somebody can program if you know how long that they've been doing it professionally. But in my experience, I mean, I've known tons of guys who have been professionally developing for 2 years who are just as good as guys who have been professionally developing for 15 years. You know, it's just, yeah. It's about, are they putting in the time and effort and learning and keeping up to date on trends and all that kind of stuff.
So this weekend, I'm going to first of all keep studying JavaScript. That is my life. But I want to start thinking about what I would want my portfolio to look like and do. And other than the Hacktoberfest event, I think like towards the end of the month, maybe I could
participate. Yeah, that would be good. Cool. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. Today's subject is objects and arrays, which we've talked about a little bit before. Can either of you give me tell me what an array is?
Array is isn't it sorry, say group of variables, but that's not array.
You're going to say what? I'm sorry.
Group of variables.
In the sense that like you can set a variable to an array, but you can set pretty much anything to a variable. An array is just a list. So it's multiple things. So for example, I can do something like this, which is just like cheese and broccoli and pizza. So that's an array, right? It's just a list of things. Now you write it in JavaScript this way, and the benefit of it is when you have a list, then we can use what? What do we use lists or arrays for previously? What if I wanted to print to the console, eat the cheese, and then eat the broccoli, and then eat the pizza? How can I do that if I have an array? What's that?
By doing a loop.
Yeah, by doing a loop. That's exactly right. Sorry. Okay. So if I create an array and I set it equal to a variable, I could say foods. So foods, and I can say foods is cheese, pizza, and broccoli. Not sure how to spell broccoli. One L. It's one L. Okay, cool. All right, so we have foods, and so if I want to loop over that and say eat the food, I can create a loop. Does you guys remember how to do that? For, yep. Yep.
You're asking what comes next?
Yep.
Okay.
What's a string, right?
Nope.
For parentheses.
Yep.
The variable.
What's the variable?
Is it foods?
So,
I don't know what this
so
is.
tell me the whole syntax, and we'll work back from there. Just read exactly what is written there.
Okay, it's for parentheses I equals 0.
Ah, okay. So that is like an old school JavaScript for loop. There's a much simpler way when you have an array.
Okay.
So if we search, let's just go to Google and we're going to search for loop over array JavaScript. Loop through an array JavaScript Stack Overflow. That's a pretty good source. So we're going to take a look at that. And they are doing it the old way as well.
Oh, the first one is the question.
Yeah, the first one's always the question, so be careful. But here, further down, has 904 upvotes. He's doing it right here. So he's saying for S of my string array. So we can copy that. Okay, for S of my string array. What is my string array reference to?
The array.
The array. So what should it be in our case?
For, I guess, foods.
Yeah, foods. So then what is S?
Which food?
Yeah, which food? So if I console.log out S right now, what are we going to get?
Cheese.
Cheese, and then...
Oh, no, you'll get broccoli, because it's going to keep looping to the last one.
So if we were setting it equal to another variable, that would be true. Because we're just consoling it, logging out as it goes, we're going to see each one and it's going to come one at a time.
Okay.
So if I put a debugger in just to stop it on each iteration of the loop, okay, so we haven't console logged out anything yet, but if I go to the next iteration, we get cheese, and then the next iteration we get pizza, and the next iteration we get broccoli. Okay, so the variable on the left is the item in the array on each iteration of the loop. Okay, so if we go back to here, if we change S to be food, does that change anything?
No.
No, because it's just variable. Just making up a name.
No, and that was my question. Yeah, you could just change that.
Yeah, it can be literally anything, blue sky, whatever. I mean, usually you want to name your array something plural because they're a list of things, and then you want to name the item the singular of that because it's just easier to read, but it doesn't matter what you name any of these things. All that matters is that what's on the right of the of references our array variable, and what's on the left is the item that we can access inside of our loop. So if I wanted to say eat the, I can just eat the, and if you remember from concatenation, we can just plus. And now we get eat the cheese, eat the pizza, eat the broccoli. Okay? So what are arrays again?
They are lists.
They're lists. It's just a list of things. And what are they useful for? Loops, because we can loop over things so we can write the code one time instead of lots of times. Okay. So then, does anybody remember what an object is?
Object.
Is the class.
A collection of properties bound by curly brackets.
Yep, it's a collect.
To a data type, a values of any data type.
To values of any data type. Yeah. So an object is like a class in a lot of languages, but it's more frequently referred to as a hash in most languages. JavaScript does special things with hashes. They are objects. We might get into that in a little more detail later. For right now, we're just talking about it as a data type. It's just hash, which is say it goes inside of curly braces, and then it has keys, so like name and values. Sam, age, location, C, and then like siblings. And we could just do an array here. It's like Josh and Grace. Okay, so what it's saying by it can have properties with values of any type. We see 3 types of data here, right? So what is Sam?
Name.
Yeah, but what's the data type? Or we call things that are in quotes something. It's a string. So this is a string. And then 34 is a number. Yeah, that one's more straightforward. And then DC is a string. And then Josh, comma, Grace is a array. Okay. So an object, and so you can have objects of objects as well. So instead of doing Josh and Grace here, I could do name, Josh, age, 32, right? Something like that. And then do the same thing for Grace. Name, Grace, age 32. Okay.
But why would you do an object within an object?
Because that's how I want. So like, let's say, let's do that. So let's say that I create a me object. So I'm going to create an object called me. I'm going to say it has name Sam, age 34. And then I'm going to create a Josh object. And then I'm going to create a Grace object. All right. So I have these 3 things. Now one of the things I can do is either at the end, so here I could say siblings are Josh and Grace. And what's Josh here?
Josh is.
Josh.
Josh is not in quotes, which means
Not a string.
it's not a string, which means
Variable.
it's a variable. And so the Josh variable is this object, right? So this is the equivalent of me,
Okay.
right? Substitution, right? Okay. So we have Josh and Grace there, and that way I can put my siblings and I get more information about them, and you can then like loop over my siblings and do things with it.
Okay.
So we'll do more examples of that, but that's why you might want to do something like that.
Okay. And then in layman's terms, how would you describe an object? Just if you
It's just attributes. It's just characteristics. It's just a way of defining descriptors about one thing, right? So eye color. So like if you're describing a person, you would create an object of eye color blue, hair blonde, shirt size large, right? Like, and so it's just a way of describing a single thing, all as one, right? That's it. So an object is a single. We refer to them frequently as entities, right? An entity is like a person. An entity frequently in many object-oriented languages is a class. But it is just a way of describing a single thing with lots of attributes.
Okay.
Okay.
And then you would, like, if you were writing code, you'd have to name that object as well.
You don't have to name the object, but if you want to use it for anything moving forward, you should name it. It's just assigning it to a variable, just like you assign a string or a number or any of the other things we've done to a variable.
Okay.
So in this case, right, I'm assigning this object of name Josh to a Josh variable.
Right.
You don't have to do that. I could do this, right? But that's not very useful because it doesn't end up doing anything. But I could, remember, because we just talked about this, do something like that. Now I'm not naming the object anything, I'm not assigning it to anything, but it is getting placed onto the me object.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yep. All right. So let's go ahead and go back to our to-do list example. So that's arrays and objects, and we're going to bring them back into our to-do list example. We did this last time, and I maybe even started the time before, but we're going to continue this exercise until we have a fully working to-do list. So I have my HTML, which has my to-do list. We have an item. We have submit. All right, so this is my HTML. It's just saying, hey, I have my to-do list. We have a list with an ID of my UL. We have an input, which is my input, and then we have a button, which is submit, which says create task. So if we look at this, what is this input HTML? How does that display in our browser?
Oh, it displays as the item in the button.
So input type equals text, ID equals my input.
Yeah,
What?
the space, it's the space that you type into.
It's the space you type into. Yeah, it's the thing that you type into, exactly. And then the button is
The button you put,
the button, and then errors is,
the errors that you get if you don't do it right.
that's probably where we would put it, but right now there's nothing in there, right? It's just an empty div. And then the same thing with UL. So what is UL right now? What does that look like on our page? Nothing, because there's nothing inside of here, right? So if we look back at our page, we can actually inspect it and see that, right? So we can see the empty UL, which is nothing on our page. We can see the input, which is our box, and the button, which is our button, and errors, which again is just blank, it's empty on our page. Okay. So if I want to be able to type into my input, and then when I click submit, I see the list item show up. How do we get there? What do I need to do?
You in JavaScript.
Yep. Yeah, you can look back to last week's stuff. You can Google. Or in case maybe I just want to work through this exercise all the way.
In JavaScript, if you want to, so you need to write a function for when you hear it click.
Yeah, so that's that's on the right track.
You have to create a script tag.
So our script tag, like in our examples, is always there. So we have the script tag right here.
Oh, okay.
I just, because we went over that earlier on, I just always leave it here, but there's script source index.js, which refers to our index.js file, which is where we're going to write our JavaScript. So yeah, that is the first step.
What was it? Did we call it something last time?
Call what something?
When we were writing this?
The function. There should be a to-do, I think you called it Shikara to-do. If you do get space branch, you should be able to see it, and then you can get checkout. Say that?
Say function show input.
So we can create a function called show input. So let's start with this. Whenever we want to interact with our HTML, what's the first thing we need to do? So for example, I want to listen, which Carl already said, to when you click on the submit button. So how do I listen for a click on the submit button?
You have to tell it to listen. Like you have to put in a function to listen.
Yeah, but what does that look like? Because it's very specific. Like that's the JavaScript code we need to write.
Okay. So you want to listen when you click.
Yeah, I want to listen for when I click on the submit button.
So you're talking about when you the line where you call it. Okay. Document get element by ID.
Yep.
Where's the ID? Create task.
Yeah, you see that, Charles? Because the ID on our button is create task. So we're going to search the document for an element that has an ID of create task. And then
add event listener.
Yep.
Parentheses quote click.
Yep.
Listening for the click, comma. And what are we doing? We're adding a new. Are we going to define an element? Or is this where we're adding the list items?
Yes, is where we're going to add the list items.
So new element, which we have to go define.
So the first thing, we have one more thing we have to put inside of add event listener. So we say document get element by ID create task, which says go and find the element with create task as the ID, which is our submit button. And then we're going to add an event listener to it. Specifically, we're going to add an event listener that's going to listen for a click, which is the first parameter. But there's a second thing we have to put in here.
Display text. Or
Yeah, so it can be display text or it can be whatever we want. What's important is it's the name of a function that's going to get called when we click on it.
Last time we called it new element.
Okay, so we can call it new element. And then what? So that's new element. So then what do we need to do next?
So we need to write the function.
So now we need to create a function.
Okay, so we could call it show input.
So we could have called it show input, but we called it new element, so we can call it new element. That's fine.
Okay. So we're writing functions. So let item equals, and now we're going to create the element, document.create element. Quotes li, because we're creating a list item.
Yep. So when we do this, so at line 2 right now, are we going to see a list item inside of our HTML document?
No.
No, why not?
Because we haven't given it a value.
We haven't given it a value, but also we haven't actually added it into the HTML yet, right? We're just creating the element in the JavaScript, but we haven't actually added it to the HTML yet. Okay. Cool. So then,
Let the variable input value equal document.get element by ID. The ID we have is my input.
Yep.
Dot value.
So what is input value going to be?
It's going to be whatever we type in my input.
Yep, it's whatever we type into my input. Yep.
The value.
Yeah, so it's the value of my input, which is literally, by the way, like I don't know if we did this last time, but like you could start the value So value is an attribute. So you can say value is something. And so now if I reload the page, it starts with something. Okay, so the value is whatever is inside of there. But yeah, so if I click the submit button right now and I console, if I just console.log out input value, what am I going to see? So if I click the submit button, what am I going to see?
Are you going to see something?
Okay. And now,
I don't think you're going to see anything because we didn't change the HTML.
but I changed the value, right? So if we go back here, so when I click on the button, it's going to call this function. It's going to say go create an item that's li, and then go get the.
Yeah, so you will get it, but you won't see it on the page. Right?
You won't see it on the page, but I will see it
in the log.
in the log.
So,
Yeah. Does that make sense? So now, anything. Right? Okay. All right. So what's next?
now you want to change the HTML or put the value into the HTML.
Okay.
So you can see it on the page.
Yeah. I think the next step. Well, okay. So tell me what the next step is.
If parentheses, input value trim.
Sorry, I'm just going to remove this value because I think. Okay. Input value.trim.
On the other side of parentheses, exclamation point equals. Close parentheses. Oh no, quotation.
Okay. So I think you see the red in syntax highlighting that's happening here?
Yeah.
It means that we messed something up somewhere. Do you see where it?
There's an extra parentheses.
Yeah. Which one should we get rid of?
The third one after trim.
Yeah, the one right after trim. Right? Okay. So what is this if statement evaluating?
If the input value
What does trim
is
do?
not blank,
Yep. What does trim do?
actions on trim removes the white space.
Trim removes the white. So if there was extra white space on either side of the word, or if it was just a blank string with spaces, it will take it away. Okay. So it removes extra spaces. All right. So to continue.
So yeah, picture is not
I'm sorry from last week. Where in Slack is this from last week? I'm sorry.
I'm looking at my GitLab
Oh,
because
yeah.
But you can look at your car's GitLab. So if you go to actually, can you just Slack on the URL? Are you looking at it in GitLab or are you looking at it on your computer?
I'm looking at it.
I'm sorry.
That was a poor way of putting that. Yeah, you're looking at it. Yeah, so if you can just put that in Slack.
Okay. Okay.
All right. So what's the next?
Okay. Item, which is the list item.
Yep.
Dot inner HTML because you want to see it on the page.
Yep.
Is set to input value.
Okay. So a couple things here. One, we're getting syntax highlighting because we have a let in front of our item. Do you know why?
Because the item could change. We have a let.
But we haven't ever changed it, right?
Right.
So since we haven't changed it, it wants it to be a constant. And it's really only when you change it that it becomes a let. So like if we actually change input value or item somewhere in our code, then we change it to a let. Otherwise, it's a const.
But it's taking in information that will change.
Will it? So far we have item equals a new element, right?
Mm-hmm.
But within the scope of the function, will item ever actually change? Like, are we going to change item to be an element that's a div?
No. Okay.
No.
So
we do change properties on item, like we're changing the property in our HTML because item is an object. Item is an object just like this is an object. Okay. And so we're changing its property in our HTML, which could just as easily be inside of here.
Oh, I thought that constant was for when the value of the variable does not change.
Correct, which it doesn't in the sense that we only ever assign item once. If you reassign item, so if you say item equals blue, which is to say we're assigning it a second time we have a second equals, then it's mad because constant should be a let.
Okay, so this is saying that item is always going to be the list item.
Yes.
Whatever the list item is.
Yes.
Okay.
Which is also, I mean, that's also okay.
Okay.
But we can go down the route of learning best practices. So yeah, unless we actually go to change what item is, it should be a constant. Otherwise, it'll be a let. Okay. So right now we said if the input value isn't blank, then we're going to set the inner HTML of item to be input value. So let's go take a look. If I refresh my page and I type in hello, when I click submit, what's going to happen?
You should see hello on the page.
Should I?
Well, I guess you have to get the oh, we didn't append it.
We didn't append it yet. So all we're doing when we click submit right now is we're saying this item that we've only created in the JavaScript that doesn't exist on the HTML yet, we want to change its inner HTML, which is to say right now if I console log out li, we're going to see an actual li element, right? Because we've seen that before. So if I console log out item, and if I put a debugger right here, we can actually look and see that we're going to update its inner HTML. But because we haven't actually put it into the HTML through an append child or some other process, it's not actually going to show up yet in the HTML. If I type, we'll see there's our actual li. Its inner HTML has been set to ADASD. And we can look, so you see item is actually an object that has all of these properties on it, all of these descriptors on it. So again, the item is a single thing. It's a HTML li element that has all of these things that you can do to it. Okay. So what we just did is we changed its inner HTML to be ADASD.
So if you wanted to print on the page, is it necessary to still put item.inner HTML?
Yes. So okay. So let's find out actually. So what's the next step?
The next step is to we put EL for element.
Uh-huh.
I don't actually know if we did that, but it's EL is set to, the element is set to document.getElementID. And our ID is, we have to create it. Oh no, it's up there. My UL.
My UL, yeah. Okay. So EL, it could be anything, right? It could be list. It could be, it's just a variable, right? Every single time that we are putting something on the left-hand side, it's a variable.
So what we want to say, we're calling the UL element because the list items go inside of the UL element.
Yes. So we want to put the item inside of the UL element. So how do we do that?
Append, so list dot append child the items.
Yep. Okay. So if I don't do this, Charles, if I get rid of the inner HTML equals, it will append the LI to the page. You can see that because there's a dot. The problem is it doesn't have any value. Like there's nothing to see. So, and we can actually do this piece before or after we append the item. So I can actually change the inner HTML after we've added it. And what that looks like is, if I put a debugger in on each one of these, so remember JavaScript always reads from top to bottom. So we're going to do each one of those steps one at a time. So we're going to go find the list item. So now we have the list item, which actually references that area that's blank right now. And then we're going to append the item, so you can see the dot shows up. And then we're going to change the inner HTML of that LI. If I change it around and I put inner HTML first, so now our item has an inner HTML of Fief. Our list is just getting the list item, which is currently blank, and we're going to append the child, but it doesn't append the child and then put the value in. It already has that value, so it just puts the whole thing in. Okay. So we're modifying the item, which is this JavaScript element that we've created, in line, and then we're at whatever point in time appending it into the HTML. So this right here is what actually causes it to get put into the HTML. At no point prior to that is it in the HTML. Okay. It's not the only way to put things in the HTML. There's prepend child. There's lots of different ways, but the most common one for a list is append child because it's just going to put it at the bottom of the list. Prepend child would put it at the top of the list. Okay. All right, so that gets us all the way to the point of actually creating a nice list. All right. Okay. The next thing that we want to be able to do is, let's say we want to check off our list items. Okay, so we want to mark them as done. The way that we're going to do that is by having a check, an input item that's a checkbox next to each one of our items. So how would we do that? Any idea? So let's think about it this way. So we're changing the inner HTML right here to be input value. Could we do anything here that would just put a checkbox?
I guess you could do a comma and then whatever you write the checkbox.
Yeah, so you can do a plus, so it's a string, right? And so concatenation for a string, we add another piece of the string. So we can write it right here, which is just going to be input type equals. So whenever you start using single quotes inside of single quotes, it'll end the string. So we want to use double quotes and single quotes. But type is checkbox.
So can you use double quotes, or no?
Say that again?
Can you use double quotes, or no?
No, it's the same thing. So you could do single quotes and then double quotes on the inside, or double quotes and then single quotes on the inside. The alternative is you can use double quotes or single quotes. You just have to do it's called escaping. It's just a little less easy to read. So generally speaking, you'll do something like that. So what this is saying is that we're going to set our inner HTML to be whatever the input value is, and then in addition to that, create a checkbox. So that's cool. So I can actually mark the things off and say, I'm done. All right. Now I want to go one step further, and I want to make it so that when I click on my checkbox, we strike it through. So you've seen before, I'm sure, like in Word documents or on the internet, where you have a word, or a group of words even, go to store, and then they draw a line straight through the middle of it. There's a way to do that with CSS.
Can I see that?
Yeah.
So what's CSS strike?
So we want to do a CSS strike through. So first of all, let's figure out how to do that in CSS. If you guys want to try to look it up.
So would you apply what's it called? A class of text decoration?
Yeah, so a property of
Property.
text decoration.
Yeah.
Yep.
CSS.
Yeah, so this is, so yes, it is a CSS thing, but we're going to apply it using JavaScript.
Okay.
So what we're going to do is we want to end up with text decoration line through, right? Which is going to put a line through our words. And the way we're going to do that, so let's start by, we're going to wrap. Actually, we can do it. That's fine. All right. So we have our item. We can say item dot style equals, and then we'll just say text decoration strike, or what was it? Line through? Line through.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so all we did, if you remember back to the various ways that we can change CSS, is we can, one, create a file that's our CSS file, and then we import that file, right, which is the most common way of doing it. Two, you can create style tags in your HTML and write your CSS in the style tags. Or three, you can do inline styling, which is where you change an attribute on the element called style and set it equal to your CSS. So you see right here, that's what we've done.
Yeah.
We've changed the attribute for the list element to have a style with text decoration line through.
But what if you didn't want it to strike through until you were done?
Yeah, because we don't want it to strike through yet, right? We only want it to strike through after we click the checkbox, right? So I was just showing, like, that's the first step, so we can see that we can change the style that way. But really, we only want to strike through the style when we click on the checkbox, right? So there's a couple of different ways that we could do this. What are you guys thinking about, like, how we might approach this? So what we want to happen is that when we click on the checkbox, we strike through the list item.
Element.style.
Oh.
But we want to do, so let's start with how do we do anything after we've clicked on the checkbox. So like if I even just wanted to say, when we click on the checkbox, I want to console log out hello.
Event listener.
So you need an event listener. And we need an event listener on what exactly?
On the checkbox.
On the checkbox, which is right here, right? So how do we put an event listener onto that checkbox?
Do we do another item?
So we can do another item. What do you want to do?
Item dot
So we could. So there are some ways that we could go with that, but so there are some ways that we go with that. How are we listening for a click event? Because we just want to listen for a click event, right? How are we listening for a click event on the button right now?
We did document get element by ID and then added an event listener.
Yep.
So if you want to, do you want to do that?
Yeah, here, that's it.
Is it like sirens or something?
If we want to listen, well, what are we listening to?
So we want to look
on the checkbox.
Yes.
So do you need an ID on the checkbox?
We could start there. Yep.
Okay.
I think that's what I'm gonna set element.
Yep.
Okay, check. And then, do we need to put it up there or do we need to put it at the bottom? It doesn't matter.
It does matter. So if I put it here, let's say. So let's just start writing it though. Let's just write it and then we'll decide where it is.
Document get element by ID. Check. And dot admin listener.
Yep.
Click.
Yep. And then
Big
what?
comma line through.
What's that?
Oh, that one.
So it's comma something. I mean, we could call it line through. What is this? What is this next parameter? What's the thing that we write right here?
It's the behavior.
It's the behavior, which is really, so what is new element? What is that reference?
It is the new list item that we're adding on.
Well, that's what the new element is. But why did we write, remember back like 20 minutes ago, why did we write new element here? Why didn't we call this blue line or next thing or red?
Because that was a function.
Because of the function. So explicitly, new element with the second thing is in our add event listener is the function that is going to be called when the event happens. Okay, so in this case, when we click on the button that has an ID of create task, we call the new element function, right, which then runs through this set of code. So in the case of document get element by ID, check at event listener click, what do we want to write here?
Do we want to write input value doctrine?
No. So what?
The brackets for that.
So yeah, that's okay. So let's just ignore it entirely. Okay, has nothing to do with anything. Okay, what we want is when we click on the element that has an ID of check, we want to do something. So what is this second parameter again?
It's the behavior that we want to execute.
Yeah, more explicitly, it's the function. It's the name of the function that we're going to call when we click on it. Okay. So what should we write here?
I guess new element. That's a function.
It is a function, but we probably want to do different behavior, right? To your point.
Yeah.
So we can name it literally anything, right? It can be EFG. It doesn't matter. Okay. Let's just call it ABC for the moment, just to make it clear.
Okay.
But now what do we have to do?
We have to name that function.
We have to create a function.
That's what I was confused about. Like that function.
It doesn't exist. Yeah. So we have to create a function called ABC, and then that is going to execute when the check is clicked on, right? So let's go back. All right. So we're going to say we're going to call ABC when we click on the checkbox, right? Okay. So then we'll define a function called ABC, because we don't want to call new element again, right? We don't, because what would happen if we put new element here?
It would do the top one.
It would do the top one, which isn't what we want to do, right? Okay. So we're going to call it ABC, and we'll just start with console log ABC, just so we know that when we get inside of there. All right. What is the problem with the way that we have our code written right now? Because we're going to get an error when we go to refresh the page. And I'll even show you so you can have a little context, you can read the error. It says, uncaught type error cannot read property add event listener of null. at index.js line 15, and a little trick, if you click on that, it'll actually take you to the line of code. So it's saying that everything that's before here, so that's the add event listener that it can't call, saying document.getElement by ID check is null, which is to say it's absent, which is to say it doesn't exist. Why is that? Let's look at our HTML for a moment. Where is the element that has an ID of check?
It's not there.
It's not there. Why not?
We didn't put it there.
We didn't put it there because
We only added it to the JavaScript.
it's only in the JavaScript, and we haven't even added, right? So if I start typing now and I click submit, oh, well, our JavaScript's broken. But it should put it right here, right? We should end up with it right there. In fact, if I let it break after, you should be able to see that. So now I have an element with ID of check, but it's too late because what happened is that the JavaScript loaded from top to bottom again, right? And so it's going to say there's a function defined as new element, there's a function defined as ABC. Okay, now I'm going to go look for an element with an ID of create task. I'm going to add an event listener to listen for when it's clicked on, and when it's clicked on, I'm going to call new element. And then I'm going to add a second event listener to an element with an ID of check, and when it's clicked on, I'm going to call a function ABC. Right? But when it gets right here, there currently in the HTML is no element with an ID of check, and so it breaks.
Okay.
So where should we move this?
We can put it.
So let me
Put
put
it after console about ABC.
not quite. So if we put it here, what calls ABC?
Click.
But it won't, because remember, so let's go through this a little bit slowly. So right when we're reading the JavaScript, what's happening is the browser opens up this file and it says, let me start executing the code. It looks here and it says there's a function called new element and it's going to do these things, but it doesn't run any of the code between 2 and 10. Right? And the reason for that is that it's a function, and the only way that we run the code inside of a function is if the function's called. Which means if I write new element right here with the open parentheses, that is calling that function, which means that on line 12 we're going to call new element, so then we're going to run the code between lines 2 and line 9. Okay? Because I don't do that, new element never gets called, and so the lines 2 through 10 haven't been executed yet. Then I go to line 12 and it says, okay, there's a function called ABC. That's great. I know that that's been defined, but I'm not going to, nothing again is calling it, right? And so it doesn't do anything yet. Then we get down here and we say, when we click on the element with an ID of create task, then we want to call new element, right? But we still haven't called ABC. So what calls ABC? How do we ever get these two lines of code to execute? We don't, right? The only way to make those two lines of code execute is to write in here ABC. Now, you've created what's called infinite recursion, which is kind of neat. It'll like completely break our browser if we run this. But what happens is, if I click on ABC, oh, actually it won't do infinite recursion. It's okay. So if I click on ABC, now, because ABC has been called, and now we've actually added the event listener, now it'll call ABC again, which will add another event listener. And then when I click on it, it'll call, right? But generally speaking, you want your add event listener to be outside of the function that you're calling. It can be in another function, it can be somewhere else, but you don't want it to be in the same function that it's going to call, because that's a weird, it's a weird thing that happens. Right? Because like you're essentially saying, I want to create another one of myself whenever I click on the check. Okay. All right. So to simplify this a little bit, we can't leave line 16 where it is because we haven't created an element with an ID of check yet. So we have to wait until we create an element with an ID of check before we run line 16. So where can we put line 16?
After line 17?
So if we put it after line 17, will there at this point be an element with an ID of check in our HTML?
There, if you have executed the new element function, then there should be an element with ID of check.
Yeah, but I haven't, right? Because again, this runs immediately. Here, let me try this. So I'm going to put debuggers in and we'll stop along the way. Okay, so there's a debugger inside a new element. There's a debugger inside of ABC. There's a debugger right before we add the click event. And there's a debugger right before ABC. Okay? So let's run that. So we never got to line 2. We never got to line 14. And the reason is that those are functions that haven't been called yet. Right? So if I go to the next one, now I've added the event listener. This is where we're adding the wait for a click to our button. And now in the next line, I'm going to try to add an event listener of click to an input to our check, right? But does our check element exist currently? Is our checkbox there? So what's going to happen? You're going to get an error. All right. So now if I actually go ahead and create an item and click submit, now I go inside of the new element. I'm going to go through and it'll execute all this code, so it's actually going to put a new element in there for me. But that's it. Like, we never go back and execute line, what was it? Line 21 never gets executed ever again. So it broke the first time when we loaded the page, and it never gets executed again. Because it's not in a function that gets called at another time, and it is just at the base of the JavaScript, so it just runs when we open up our browser, but that's it. Okay, so we have to move it somewhere. We have to move it right after we create a checkbox and put it in the HTML. So where do we create a checkbox and put it in our HTML?
On line 6.
On line 6, yeah. So if we try that, select debugger. It still can't find it because we added an input with an ID of check to the inner HTML of the item, but is item in our HTML page yet? No, because when does it actually go into the page?
At append child.
At append child. So we actually want to move this all the way down here. Okay. So that worked, right? So now when we click on the checkbox, it console logs out ABC.
Now, in the console log, it started counting.
It's because every time I do it, it's doing another log, and because they're the same thing, it's just telling you how many times. Instead of just putting it on a new line every time, it's just telling you how many times it's happened.
Okay.
But it's happening every time. So if I put a debugger there, it'll stop here every time. See. Okay, so I don't want to console log out ABC. What do we actually want to do when we click on the checkbox? Line through. And how do we do that again?
So document.
Remember, so how do we get the line through? The line through is a CSS thing, right? And so the way that we did this, it's still up there. We did something up there that is going to actually create the line through. the commented outline, right? So item.style equals now, just give it a try. So here's the problem. When we call ABC, what is an item inside of ABC?
Constant. Make a list.
So remember, variables that you define inside of your function are only defined inside of your function.
Yeah.
So we defined item right here, but when we get over here, we actually don't have access to any item. So there's a couple of ways that we can do this. One way is that we can pass item as a parameter into ABC. Now to do that, we have to do something that's a little bit tricky. We've been, in our adding event listeners, we've always just named the function, and then that's what ends up getting called. That's fine. That's called passing a callback. Another way to do this, though, is you can actually write the function in line. And so in our case, we can just write a function without a name. It's called an anonymous function. And in that case, we can pass into item. We can pass the item into ABC. I know that's a little bit confusing. So this is an anonymous function, it's called. Okay, so an anonymous function is a function without a name. See, we're not naming it right here. That anonymous function is, all it's doing is calling the ABC function with item. Okay. Unfortunately, you can't just call ABC item. Now, what we could do instead of this is we could, so what we could do is delete everything that's inside of ABC and just inside of this function replace ABC item with our code. So you could do that. Okay, we're just doing it this way to make it a little bit cleaner to read. But those are the exact same thing.
You do item.style.function.
No. So again, this function is just like writing function new element. Right? We created a function new element, and then when it's called, it's going to execute all the code that's inside of here. What happens when we use this add event listener is what we're really doing is passing a function to this add event listener function, and then that function is going to get called inside of the add event listener function. Which I've gone over this before a couple times. It's an incredibly confusing process. So for the moment, let's just say you pass in ABC item into this function, and so by putting function around the function that we actually want to call, it allows us to pass parameters. That's really what we're trying to get to. Okay, we need a way of passing a parameter into ABC when it gets called, and the way that you do that in the add event listener is you have to type it just like this. So it's just function, open close parentheses, and then open close curly braces, and inside of there you can call your actual function with your parameters. So in our case, item, or I.
So then you don't need line 11 and 12 if we have function on line 8?
So you do, because the function on line 8, what is it doing right here, Shakara?
It's calling the function.
It's calling which function?
ABC function.
Yeah.
So you have to write.
So you have to write it.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, we can go over anonymous functions again at a later point. In all of the other difficulties of understanding JavaScript, that one takes a little bit to wrap your mind around. So I just want to ignore it for a moment.
Wait, what is the I?
So what is I? It's been a little bit since we've talked about functions, right? So I is,
Variable?
it's a variable, but it's a special type of variable, right? So let's go back to basics a little bit on that. So if I do function say hello, and I pass it in name. And then I say console.log hello plus name. And then I call, say hello, John. What are we going to see when we load our page?
Okay, so you have function say hello, pass in name, console.log hello plus name, say hello John, you will see John. Hello John.
Hello, John. Right? And the reason is that John becomes name when it gets called. And so if I have say hello James, what are we going to see?
Hello James.
Yeah, so we'll see hello John and then hello James.
Okay.
Right, so we'll see both of those because it gets called twice. And, okay. So if I go back to what we have, right here we're calling ABC with item. What is item right here?
Item is the variable,
Yep, which references
the list item.
the list item, right? So if I call ABC item, what is I going to be? It's going to be the list item.
Okay.
You see, it's exactly the same as the say hello name.
Okay.
You don't believe me.
But you don't want to call it list?
We can call it whatever we want. What do you want to call it? So we're going to pass in the item. So what do you want to call this?
Li?
Yeah, we can call it LI. And then we have to change this to LI, right? Yeah, I don't care. We call it whatever you want. The point is, it doesn't matter what you call it. All that this is doing is giving you a reference for whatever is passed in, so that inside of the function you can name it whatever. And the reason for that is I can name this item. I could change this to be blue, and so long as blue is
Yeah, I think I just get really confused when it's named something nonsensical.
yeah. And the problem is, if I name it completely sensical, it seems like there's something magic about the name.
Yeah.
Right? And so there is this, like, it takes a little while to wrap your head around what's actually going there. So we'll keep going back and forth on that. Okay? But yeah, we can totally call it LI. There's no problem with that. LI to style. It's just a variable that we're naming. Call it whatever we want.
Okay, so if we could just read it one more time.
Yep.
So we have a function in new element, and we have constant variables, item and input value. So we have the item set to search the document for an element with the ID of list. No.
Okay, so let's
Search the document for the list.
let's read this entire document all the way through. Okay, so if I'm the browser, how do I read this?
So the new element function.
So the first thing that happens is the browser's going to read, okay, there's a function called new element. Does it care anything about what's in lines 2 through 9 right now?
No.
No. Why not?
We have to call the function.
We have to call the function first. So let's just skip down. So now there's a function called ABC. Does it care about line 13 right now?
No.
No. So let's just skip down to the next line. So what does this line do?
Okay, search the document for an element with ID, create task.
Mm-hmm.
And listen for a click.
Yep.
And then executes the function.
When does it execute the function?
When you hear a click.
Yeah, when you hear a click. When you click on that particular element of create task, then we're going to call new element.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that brings us back to line 2, right? Okay. So what's line 2 doing?
And then we're going to search the document for.
Are we going to search the document?
Oh, we're going to create in the document.
In the document? So we're going to create, let's just call it in JavaScript.
Yes.
Okay, because we're not actually putting it into the HTML yet, we're just creating it inside of our JavaScript code.
We're going to create an element of a list item.
Yep.
And then we are going to search the document for an element with the ID of my input.
Yep, which in our case is
The element with the ID of my input.
which is what?
The what you're writing.
Yeah, where you can type in, right? Which we can see right here. It's an input of type text with an ID of my input. Okay, and then on line 4.
If the value of the input is not blank,
What's the trim? What's trim doing?
taking away the white space,
Taking away extra spaces. Yep.
then
So let's say that it was blank. What happens?
nothing.
Nothing happens. Okay. So if it's not blank, then
Then we are going to alter the inner HTML
of what?
of the element,
Which is
the list item.
the list item. Yep.
We're going to alter and set it to whatever the input value is,
Yep.
plus a checkbox.
Plus a checkbox. Yep. And then
we're going to search the document for the element with the ID of my UL.
yep.
And then inside of that, we are going to add the item.
Yep. And then
And then we are going to get the element by ID with the ID of check.
mhm.
And we are going to listen for a click.
Yep.
And then we're going to call the ABC function
Yep. With
with the item,
which is
the list item,
yep. So then where do we go from there?
to the ABC function,
Yep. So what is LI?
the list item.
Yep. And what are we doing?
We are changing the style to strike through.
Yep. We're changing the text decoration to line through, which is really strike through on the word. Okay. So you see how that's logical though, right? Like it takes a little while to be able to read through these things and see what's happening, but it executes in that very specific order, which is why, remember before, so now let's try to read through this when we had it in a bad state. Okay, so let's start over. So where do we start?
We're going to start with the, so we are looking at the page and we see there's a function, new element.
Yep,
We can't do anything until the function is called.
yep. So where do we go?
All the way to line 15.
All the way to line 15, and we skip over ABC for the same reason, right? Because it's just a function, we can't do anything with it. Skip all the way to line 15. So then what do we do?
Then we're going to get element by ID, the element with the ID of create task.
Yep.
And then listen for a click.
Yep.
Then we're going to add the new element. We're called the new element function.
But we're only going to call the new element function when?
When we hear the click.
When we hear the click. So have we clicked on anything yet?
No.
Okay, so what do we do next? It keeps going, so it's
Yeah.
line 16. So because we haven't clicked anything yet, right? So this only gets called when we click on the button. Since we haven't clicked on the button, we still don't go into line 2, right? So then we go to line 16, right? Because that's the next thing. So what does this do?
Searching the document for the element with the ID of check.
And can it find one?
No.
No. So what's going to happen?
We're going to get an error.
We're going to get an error. You see that? So then right there it says, okay, there's something wrong. I can't continue to execute. That's a bad piece of code. You just read it. Like you didn't have to look at a computer, right? You understand that that's a bad piece of code. So where do I need to move this code?
You need to move line 16.
Well, so what are we waiting for? What do we need to happen before?
We need to do the create task.
So, well, but specifically we need to wait for what?
The click.
Well, but specifically we really need to wait for an element with an ID of check to be on our page,
Yes.
right? Because it's going to break until there's an element with an ID of check on the page. Okay. So We need to move this to a place after we've created an element with an ID of check and put it on the page. So where does that happen?
After we append.
After we append, which is why we moved it up here. Does that make a little more sense now?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Cool. So let's just give it a shot. Cool. There's just one little problem.
It's not staying.
It is staying, right? It won't go away, right? You see? So it's like no matter if I uncheck it, it's still drag through. Okay. So the way that we want to deal with that is we can change the style back and forth. Okay, so we can say if let's see. It's the easiest way to do this. So we can say if true, I'm just going to pass it in directly true, then we're going to do this, which is going to set the style to line through. Otherwise, we're going to set the style to, what's the option? Probably none. So we want to have an if-else clause that's going to look to see if the checkbox is checked, then we want to put the line through. Otherwise, we want it to be none. Right? So how do we know if the checkbox is checked? So we have to listen for check. I mean, we are listening for the click, so that should tell, we should be able to get information about the checkbox after the click. The way that we do that is in all of these places where we're adding an event listener, so our functions are getting called and passed a parameter that we don't know about yet, we haven't talked much about. It's called event. Okay, so we are calling these functions without any parameters, but they actually have a parameter. So for example, we could here, and you can name it whatever you want, but it's going to be the event. It's going to tell you about what actually happened. Okay, so I can call it E or event or whatever we want. I'm going to call it event for the moment, and I'm going to put a debugger in, and we're just going to look at what an event looks like when you click on the submit button first. So right now, if I click event, or if I type in event, it'll tell me more about event, or if I scroll over event, I can see what event is. Again, it's another one of these objects that has a whole bunch of information on it, including things like the fact that it's a mouse event, because it was a click, right? We used our mouse to click. We also know that it happened at an offset on the x-coordinate of 22 and an offset on the y-coordinate of 8, and then a page on the x-coordinate of 146 and a page y of 78. It's essentially the exact locations coordinately on the screen for the browser for where I actually clicked on the thing. We also learned some things about the path, right? So it was from the button create task, right? So it tells us that. It gives us the source element, which is our actual button that we clicked on, which has all of the element information that we've already seen. It has the type, so we know it was a click, right? So there's lots of information that exists here. So now, if we look at the same thing, we can pass an event for when we click on our checkbox. We're going to pass that event into our ABC function. So just to be clear, we see what's happening here. So when we click, we're going to call this function that gets an event, and then inside of there, we're going to call ABC now with the item and the event that was passed. Okay. So now we have LI. We have LI.
Put the event in the parameters. Why do you need to also put it in the function?
You mean why does it have to be here?
No, on line 9. Why does it have to be
Inside of the function, like right here and here?
Yeah.
Okay. So, function is the actual, without a name, is the actual function that's getting called. All it does, the only line of code that it executes is calling another function that we've created called ABC, right? But ABC is where we want to interact with the event, right? So in that case, ABC isn't being called with an event. And so by the time that we get to here, what is event right here?
Inside of the function?
Yep.
It is nothing.
It's nothing. So if we want to play with the event inside of here, we have to pass it into the function.
Okay.
So we're going to pass it from here into here and then into here.
Okay.
So if I look at what the event is though here, so if I click on the checkbox, we're going to get our event. It's very similar to what we saw before. It's also a mouse event. It was about a click. Our current target has a whole bunch of information on it. Including value. So the value is on. That's what a checkbox has when it's on. So if I do it again, so now it's checked. So when I click this time, and I look at the event, and we go down and look at the value, what's the value here? Oh, I'm sorry. We have to look at it. So it's the value, and then we have to get the source element, which has a value of still on. So we're stuck. Let's just give it a try. Let's just do this. Console.log event.sourceElement.value. So it's on all the time, unfortunately. So let's go take a look at JavaScript is checkbox checked. Lots of people have searched for that before. So there's a checked attribute on our checkbox element. So if instead of doing source element.value, I do checked,
Okay.
so now we have true and false, right? So what do I want to put, instead of just putting false here, what do I want to put?
Check.
So if the event's source element, which is the checkbox that we're clicking on,
Yes.
is checked, then I want to strike a line through. Otherwise, I want to set the text decoration as none. So if we give that a try, boom.
Okay. So in the function, we have to pass through the parameter of event.
Yep.
And then when we call the function, we need to call the function with the item and the event.
Yep. And the reason is, I can go. We'll take a break and I'll go over anonymous functions, and it'll help us to understand what's actually happening there, because it's a confusing thing. But there is another way that we could do this without event. So what is this source element here?
The source element is the list item.
Nope. So remember, how did I get to ABC? So let's walk back through this. So I add an event listener to create task, so that when I click on the new task, create task button, it calls new element. That brings us to line 2, where we create a list item, and then we go get the value of the input, and then we look to see if that value is blank, and if it's not blank, Then we go and set the inner HTML of the input value to be a checkbox. Then we go find the list, and then we append the item onto the list. And then, and only then, we go and find an item called with an ID of check, and we listen for a click. And when a click happens, then we call ABC, passing in an item and an event. Okay. So what we've clicked on is this input right here, this checkbox, right? So when we click on that checkbox, we then call ABC. So the event's source element is what? So the element that the event originated from is what source element refers to.
The checkbox.
The checkbox. So we're looking to see if the checkbox is checked. So we did it this way, which is based on the event, which we'll see is a powerful thing when you have more than one item. But until then, what could I do instead of event.sourceElement to get access to the checkbox? How do we find elements?
Get element by
Yep.
ID.
So we could just do this. And then you actually don't need event.
Okay.
You see why? They're the exact same thing. Okay, we're just looking for, at this point in time, is that element checked? It's just nice to do it from the event for reasons we'll see later. But you don't have to. You can just go find that item.
Okay.
Okay, so yeah, let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and I'll talk about anonymous functions, and then we'll let you guys work through some of the labs so I can try and help. And in the meantime, I'll push this up to to-do. Oh. What's that? Yeah, because I'm on your branch, so I'm gonna.
Is that just statement?
It's okay. I'm just creating a SAM to do too. Changes.
Why does it say different?
So it's showing the differences between what's.
You click compare.
Yeah, it's just the differences between what's on master and what's on my branch.
National Basilica. Is that the name of it?
The National Cathedral?
Cathedral. But that's not the basilica.
I don't think so. I think
What's the name of the basilica? Basilica of National Shrine. Is that short?
so. There is a National Basilica. Is that in Catholic?
Yeah.
Yeah. The National Cathedral is the one that's up in Northwest. It's over by like Glover.
I've been doing freelance work. So could not be more. I feel like their entire mission is to be on my nerves.
What type of freelance work is it?
Communication consulting. So there's this new rideshare service launching in DC. They operate in Europe and Asia.
Okay.
And they want to start in DC, and they're just getting started. So I am like the local comms person, so they don't do embarrassing things like all upper Shaw.
Oh, I see. Mm-hmm.
But they're just so unorganized, and I'm a very organized person, so that is already a challenge. But also, I sent them an invoice on Friday, and I still haven't received it. I hate asking people for my money.
Yeah.
I should not have to chase
Yeah.
for my money. You do not have to chase any news work. I can't.
Yeah. Oh, that's incredibly frustrating. Yeah, I was doing freelance development work before I started doing real stuff, and I ended up getting screwed over for like $1,500 worth of work that I did. Guy just never paid. So.
See, that is not an option, but I'm going to meet lawyers on a personal level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
That's so weird.
Yeah. All right, so let's look at what is really happening with these functions that have these events from parameters that we don't understand. All right, so I've defined 4 functions here. The one that is most like our addEventListener function is this last one, which is progress. So you can see that progress takes in 2 parameters, started and finished. But started and finish are being called like functions, not like other parameters that we passed in before. And that's because just like you can pass in strings or arrays or objects or any other data type into a function as a parameter, you can also pass functions into functions as a parameter. Okay. So
this was called what now? I'm sorry.
So this is these are going to be callbacks, which is the same as, remember a moment ago we were doing this document.getElementById, create task addEventListener. So addEventListener, so getElementById is a function, and so is addEventListener. And so the addEventListener function takes in 2 parameters. The first one is the event type, which we said is click in our case, and then the second thing it takes in is the name of a function. So like we said, new element, right? So really what it's taking in as its second parameter is a function, okay? And what's going to happen is eventually inside of the addEventListener function, it's going to call the new element function. And it's going to pass into that function the event, which is what we were able to get access to before. Remember when we had event.sourceElement?
Yeah.
It was because at a later point in time, inside of the addEventListener function, it's actually calling new element and it's passing it in an event. So we're going to recreate a similar thing here with like a simple progress example. So let's just read through what's happening here. So let's start at the top. What does the browser see? What happens at line 1 for the browser?
We have a function called finish.
Yep.
And then we're going to look to see if it's called.
Yep.
And it is called at the bottom.
At the bottom, but we can't get there yet, right? Because it hasn't been called yet.
Because it hasn't called start yet, right?
Yeah. So let's see. So the way to do this is, so line 1, we see that there's a function called finish. Finish can't. It hasn't been called at line 1, so we move to the end of the function. Okay. Line 4 still hasn't called it. Line 5, there's a function called start. Start obviously hasn't been called at line 5 because we defined it there, so we go to the end of the function, which is line 7. That no function has been called, nothing's happened yet, so we go to line 9. Function current, it hasn't been called, we go to line 13. Function progress, it hasn't been called, we go to line 22. Progress is called. Okay. Progress is called with start and finish. What are start and finish?
The functions.
There are functions from way up here, right? So we're passing them in as parameters. So now we're calling progress. We go here. So what is started at this point?
We don't know what started is.
We do.
Well, if we call progress, then we're going to execute progress.
Yep.
Which tells us start is a variable.
Okay, so let's go back. So we skip all the way through all these functions. We get down to line 23. We call progress. We pass into progress start and finish. What are start and finish?
Functions.
They're the two functions, right? They're this start function and this finish function. So if these are the parameters and the order matters, right? When we get in, so now we've called progress, so we're going to go inside of progress. What is started at this point?
That started right there.
Yep.
That one.
Yep.
With new date.
Nope, right here. So what is started right here?
Oh, started is there. It's a parameter for progress.
It's a parameter for progress. And what did we pass in for this parameter for progress? Let me try this in a different way. Remember our say hello example. So if I made progress be like our say hello example.
Okay, so it's a variable.
So what is name? Humor me for a second. So what is name at this point?
A variable.
Well, but what is it? Like if I call progress right here with John, what is name right here?
John.
It's John,
Mm-hmm.
right? Okay. So now if I put that back and it's start and finish, and we know that start is the start function and finish is the finish function, what is started and finished?
They are variables.
They're variables, but just like name was a variable that was actually John, they're start and finish. Yeah, you see that? Yeah, because it's exactly the same. There's no difference between these two things. I know it feels different because we're passing in functions, but it's not any different. It's exactly the same thing. Okay, so all we're doing is passing in this entire function here and this entire function here as variables called started and finished. Okay?
I just always get confused just because like we're not actually like naming the variable like the original way.
But it's anonymous.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the whole point is that I can pass in whatever I want, right? Like I could have a different one.
No, I get it. Like while we're talking about it, like,
yeah, it's hard to keep track of, but like just to prove the point even more, right? Like I can create a finish to and a start to, and they're gonna say finished second time at and started second time at, okay? And then down here I can call progress start and finish, but I can also call progress start and finish too. So let's say that we moved past, we already called progress the first time, now we're calling progress the second time. So what is started now?
Now it's start to.
It's start to, which is this function, right? Okay. So we'll go back to getting rid of that. But that's the point. The reason why you have to assume that these things are named differently than whatever is getting passed into them is that what gets passed in is going to change.
So when you are calling, when you are calling a function, you're calling functions within a function,
Mhm.
are they always going to be anonymous?
No. So in our case, they're technically not anonymous because they're named.
Okay.
So it's the putting the name in front of it, not having a name in front of it that makes it anonymous, right? Just like you'd be the way that you're anonymous online or in your life is that people don't know who you are, right? So there's not an actual name. That's what makes it anonymous. What we're doing right now is called a callback,
Okay.
which we could pass in an anonymous function, which we'll get to that in a second. But right now what we're doing is a callback, which is to say I am going to call back to that function from inside of another function. So in our case, we're going to, okay, we get all the way to the bottom, we call progress, we get start and finish. Right here, started is start, which is really this function up here, right? So if I call started with new date, what happens? Where should we go? Where does the browser go with the code?
If you call started with new date, where does the browser go?
Yeah, so what's the next line of code we need to look at? Remember, what is started?
Started is start.
Okay.
So you look at start.
So then we go to start. So what is timestamp at this point?
Timestamp is a variable.
Yep, which is?
Started.
Nope.
I don't know what timestamp is.
What did started get called with?
Started was called with start.
Well, so started right here, we're going to call, that is start,
That's start.
right? So what are we passing in? What's the first parameter in started?
Timestamp.
It's
New date.
it's new date.
So new date is timestamp.
Yeah, so new date is timestamp. And a new date in JavaScript is just a timestamp. It's just going to give us a date time.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, okay, so
Sorry.
what is timestamp right here?
New date.
It's new date. Yeah. So what are we going to console log out at that point?
Start at whatever the new date is.
Whatever the new date is, whatever the time happens to be right there, right? Okay. So then we finish with this function. So we go back to right after started. So what are we going to do next? What's this doing?
This is a loop
It's a loop from what to what?
from 0
Yep.
to 1,000.
1 trillion, something very large, right? Okay. So when we're looping through that, at each item, what are we doing here? Sorry, I should have.
We are.
Oh wait, sorry. Let me. Okay. So what is cur?
It is current.
It is current, which is our function. So when we get right here, what are we doing?
We are executing current.
We're going to execute current. What's number at this point? I, which is, let's say we're on the first iteration of the loop.
0.
0. So then what does this say?
If
Yep.
I
Yeah.
is that large number divided by 2,
Yeah, which is the same as this number. I just copied them. Then what?
then log out halfway there.
Yeah, so when I is 0, it's not half of that large number, so we just skip it, right? But then the next iteration of the loop, what do we do? So when I is 1, we call it cur, which is current, which is 1. We check to see if 1 is half of that number. It's not, so we move on. Then I is 2, 2 is not half 3, 3 is not half 4, 4 is not half blah, 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 until we get it to whatever it is, 500,000 or 5 million or whatever the actual number is. Okay. At which point we log out halfway there. So when we're halfway there, we're going to log out halfway there. Okay. And then after we finish that entire loop, what happens on line 21?
We execute finished.
And what is finished?
It is finished.
The
function finished.
Function finish. So timestamp there is
Timestamp is new date,
new date, which is
which is
just the date time of at that point, right? So when we call started new date, we're going to say console.log started at some time, and then later we're going to call current, which is going to say halfway there, and then later we're going to call finished, which is going to say finished at whatever time it's finished. Okay, so if I go back, you see how it takes time?
Okay.
And that's because we're waiting for the loop to get halfway
So
done
it
and then
takes real
finished.
time.
So it takes actual time.
Timestamp takes real time.
Yep, it's real time. So like you can see the actual time, Wednesday, October 10th, 2018 at 20, so at 8:05. Okay, so the point of this is that you can pass functions into functions, and that those functions can then get called with parameters, with data. So this is exactly what's happening with our add event listener. Okay, it gets called with it gets passed an event by the add event listener function when the add event listener function calls it inside of itself. So essentially, if we were to change this, like just for a little bit more clarity, add event listener, okay, and we'll actually make something that's equivalent to our event listener. So we'll say that it's going to take a type and a function, okay, which could be anything. These are all, again, just names I'm making up, right? So it's going to take a type and a function. And when it gets called, or in this case, essentially when it gets clicked, we're just going to call it explicitly. We're going to call the function, and we're going to pass it an event, which is just going to be an object that has things like inner HTML and source element. Right, I'm just making those things up, but those are real things that are on the actual event, right? So essentially, it's going to have some event that has some information, and it's going to pass it into whatever the function is. So if we have add event listener, and we put click, comma, in our case we had a function called new element. Okay. So let's go through this because this is a much more equivalent setup.
Okay.
All right. So line 1 does what?
It says we have a function.
We have a function. So.
Called new element.
Yep.
That has not been called. So we're on line 3.
So we're on line 3. And then.
We have a function. It's called add event listener.
Yep.
That function has not been called. We're on line 8.
Yep.
Now we call add event listener.
Yep.
So we can execute add event listener.
Yep.
Type and function are,
Yeah, so what is type?
Type is click.
Mm-hmm.
Function is new element.
Yep.
So we are going to listen for click.
You said function as well, I'm sorry.
New element.
Okay.
And then we're
See, because they're in the same order, right? So it's whatever it is, comma, whatever it is. It's the same thing here. So it doesn't have anything to do with the name of the things. It has everything to do with the comma separation of those. Okay.
So we're listening for a click.
Yep.
And then we're executing new element.
Yep. So we're going to execute new element because new element is function, right? So we're not actually listening for a click in this case because this isn't the actual add event listener. But right now, type is click and function is new element, right? So we go to line 6, and what happens?
We are executing the new element function.
Yep.
Which is setting the inner HTML.
Nope. So we're just passing in an event.
Oh wait, the new element. So
right. So this is an event. I can change this to be a little bit more readable. Right. So I'm creating an object just very similar to the event object that we actually get passed in the add event listener case. I'm just making up what it is currently. So don't worry about me setting it, but I'm passing an event in. So the function gets event. Event is this object, which has an attribute of inner HTML that's set to blank and a source element attribute that's sent to an object. Okay. And I go inside of new element, and when I console.log out event, what am I going to log out?
You are going to log out the inner HTML.
So what is event?
Event is
let me do this slightly differently. Just gonna rename this. Okay, so again, call add event listener, click new element. So we've called add event listener. Type at this point is
click.
And function is
New element.
new element. Event is being sent equal to an object that has an attribute of inner HTML and another attribute of source element. Inner HTML, we can make it whatever we want. As something. Okay. All right. So that's event. This is just a variable. This is just like this. We're just making this thing up.
Yeah.
Okay. It just happens to have a very similar structure to what our actual events look like when they get passed to us. And then we call function, which is what?
New element.
New element. And we're passing into it a parameter of event, which is?
The variable.
Yeah, which is equal to?
Inner HTML, something, source element.
Yeah. So it's equal to this object that has two properties, one inner HTML set to something and the other source element equal to an empty object. Okay. So we call new element with that event. So what is EV?
The event.
Which is?
The variable.
Yep, which is?
The object.
The object, which is this thing that has these two. Okay. So when I console log this out, we're going to log out that object. Okay. So this is essentially what's happening when we're doing an arrow. I'll just show it. So you can see the whole object. The objects are nice because they let you like create nesting. Okay, but this is essentially the same thing as what we were doing when we're calling document.get element by id.add event listener click. The reason why we can put the EV in there, even though we don't actually see it, is because it's going to put the parameter event in later.
Okay, so in the object of event, you have, what are these called? Attributes?
Attributes or properties or keys.
So inner HTML is a property, and then source element is a property. So what is source element set to?
Another object
Another object.
that doesn't have any properties.
Okay.
It's just an empty object.
Okay.
But source element would actually have things like type and inner HTML and some other things. Okay. But you can look at it in real life when you actually do a document.get element by ID at event listener and call your function, and you can actually do a debugger and look at the event and see all the things. But it's lots. There's like hundreds of things. Okay. So this is our simpler example. All it does is log that out. Now, if I want to pass a parameter into new element, so I want to be able to pass in, like we did, like the item, as well as actually get access to the event, that's where we have to call an anonymous function. Okay, so just to be clear, let's start with a slightly simpler example. Instead of using new element here, I'm going to just create an anonymous function, which is to say it doesn't have a name. It's going to be created right here in line. Okay, and I'm going to put event, so we'll call it EV, and I'm going to console.logout EV. So what is that going to do?
So now we read the document. We have a function called add event listener.
Yep.
The function has now been called, so we're on line 7.
Yep.
Now we are calling add event listener.
Yep.
With the parameters of click
Yep.
and an anonymous function.
Yep.
So when we go to add event listener, we have click, which is type,
Yep.
and function,
Which is?
which is the function with the parameter parameter E.
Yeah, so it's this whole thing, right? Which is the same, really, as this. Because the function here, when we do new element, is this whole function here. The only difference between the two is that in one case the function has a name, and in the other it doesn't.
Okay, but here the function E
So
is not there.
So the function is, we're writing it in line, which is to say we're writing it right here.
Okay. But okay, so I have a function E.
So there's no,
written in line.
but there's not a function Eve, right? What is Eve here?
A parameter.
A parameter. So we have an anonymous function, which is to say we don't have a name for it. So we have a function here that takes a parameter of Eve, and when it's called, it's going to console log out Eve.
Yes. Where is Eve?
So if we go back, so again, add event listener, and we have click in the function, so we're going to call add event listeners. That gets us to line 3. So at this point, what is type?
Type is click.
And func is?
The anonymous function.
The anonymous function, the whole thing. Okay. So then we set event equal to this object, and then we're going to call func, which is what?
Anonymous function.
The anonymous function with the event. Okay, so that's going to bring us back into here, inside of this function, which is going to do what?
Console.logout E.
Which is?
Event.
Which is the object, right?
The object.
Yep.
Okay.
You see?
Okay.
So that's anonymous functions and named functions. You can do this either way.
So does anonymous function have to have a parameter?
No. It's just like any other function that you're defining. In this case, we want to give it a parameter because we know that add event listener function is going to pass it in an event.
Yeah.
But you don't have to have one.
So if you didn't have one, then what would it do?
Well, if you did this, so we're still going to go through the same process, right? So add event listener, it's going to have a type and a function. Type is click, function is the anonymous function. Event gets set equal to this object, and then we're going to call function with an event. That's going to go into function. There's no parameter, right? So if we console.logout Eve, what is Eve?
Eve is event.
But it's not though, right? Because
there is no parameter.
there is no parameter. So this is going to say Eve is undefined.
Okay.
Yep. So that's why. But you could, if you did this, so if you don't actually try and access Eve, and you just console log out hello, that's okay.
Okay.
That'll log out hello.
Okay. So when you have an anonymous function, if you don't put a parameter and you don't console log out a string, then you're going to get an error.
No, so it's the same. Again, this function is exactly the same. I can copy it, cut it, right? I can paste it here and give it a name. Exactly the same. So no parameter here, console logging out hello, there's no error. If I console log out Eve, there is an error because there is no Eve. There's no Eve inside of this function. It's undefined, right? Which is to say that it's never been defined. Even if I put Eve here, if I try to console log out A, what's going to happen?
It's undefined.
A is undefined. So the problem is not whether it has a parameter or not. The problem is that the variable hasn't been defined.
Okay.
Yeah. But if you don't need to do anything with the parameter, you don't need to name the parameter. It's only if you're going to use the parameter that it matters.
Okay. And why do you want to use anonymous function?
Okay, so yeah, so let me get it back. All right, so now I want to be able to,
Wait, we're here.
Yep.
And we have the variable of Eve.
Yep.
Where is Eve defined?
Okay.
Is it defined because in the function, and function is the anonymous function, there is a parameter of event,
Mm-hmm.
and it takes on that.
So let's go through it again, right? So we're going to skip past the first two functions because they don't get called, and then it gets called on line 11.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to call add event listener. At this point, type is what?
Click
And func is
the anonymous function.
the anonymous function. So then we set event equal to this object,
Mm-hmm.
and then we're going to call function with that object, with the event,
Mm-hmm.
right? So then we move inside of the parentheses, inside of the curly braces for the anonymous function, because we called it, right? So what is Eve at this point?
Eve is event.
So that's how it got defined.
Okay.
It's defined right here.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Okay. So now, why do we use anonymous functions? The reason is if I want to, in new element, I want to be able to append a person's name to the event's inner HTML. Right, so I want to do like something and then person name.
Mm-hmm.
The only way to do that, so I can't. So when you use a callback, you can't name the parameters. You can just name the function.
Mm-hmm.
So all I can say here is new element, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is, new element. How do I pass in a person name? I can't. You see what I'm saying? Because you can't call the function here. You're just naming the function here.
Mm-hmm.
The function's going to get called inside of that event listener. So if I set it up like this, then I can't add a person name as a second parameter. But what I can do is create an anonymous function right here that takes the event that'll get set by add event listener, and then all this function does is call new element with the event and a person name. So let's walk through what's going on here. So we have our function on line 1, skip past it. Function on line 5, skip past it. We call add event listener. When we get inside add event listener, what's type again?
Click
Click, and what's function?
the anonymous function.
The anonymous function. So then we set event equal to an object, and then we call func event. So where do we go from here?
Func event is the function, the anonymous function.
The anonymous function. So we go inside of these curly braces,
Mm-hmm.
right? So now we're going to call, so what is EV at this point?
It is event,
It is event, which is
the object.
the object. So if we call new event with EV and John, where do we go?
We are going to go to the new element function.
Yep. And what's EV at this point?
EV event
The event, which is
is the object.
and person name is what?
John.
John. So what are we going to log out here?
The inner HTML of the object.
Which is
something.
Mm-hmm.
And the person name.
Which is
John.
yeah. Okay. So that's why you would need to use an anonymous function. Because when you use a named function in a callback, you can't pass the parameters.
Okay.
So you have to create an anonymous function and then explicitly call your actual function.
Okay.
So the other reason to use anonymous functions, sometimes people just like to do this
Mm-hmm.
because instead of naming a function and then you have to go create the new function up there, you could do all of your code this way. Like you could, a lot of people will write like this, and then you can like put you don't need this function.
Okay.
So people will write, you'll see this fairly frequently in code. People write anonymous functions this way.
Is that considered to be more concise?
It's,
Is it better to write it that way?
I don't have a strong opinion. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure some people do. So to some extent, this is a little bit more practical in that it's inline so you can read it more directly.
Yeah.
In some ways, it's less readable because you're writing the function inside of the parameter. And so by saying click and then naming a behavior, like create new element, that's a little bit more readable. And then when you create your function, it's not being created as a function. So I don't have a strong opinion.
I guess it's just preference. Like,
It's just preference.
Do you want it to be more detailed or do you want it to be quick?
Yeah. So it's really, it's about, do you want it to be more readable or do you want it to be more readable in the sense that when I read the statement, add event listener, click create new element, to me that's more readable, like it's more obvious what's going on. Or do you want to have more code in line so you can actually see what it's doing, which is where you create the anonymous function. So yeah, so you can use the anonymous functions for two purposes. One is if there's, in the case where you're passing in a function into another function, you can just write the code right there, which makes it a little bit easier to read potentially. But the big reason why you need it is that you can't pass parameters to a named function when you're using it as a callback. Okay? All right. All of that largely for if you want to pass a second parameter, make sure that you wrap your function in another function. Okay. Yeah, so then we'll use the rest of class. You guys can start working through some labs and I'll try to help.
I have a lab.
Yep.
I just need to remember which lab it is. I pushed my code to get lab so you can see it.
I'll see you next week.
All right, man.
Yeah, it's a week 5.
Okay.
Do you think